My name is Jack Carter. Well, that's the name I'm using now. The name I was born with got tangled up in bad debts, worse decisions, and the kind of trouble that makes a man look for the furthest possible corner of the map to crawl into. Alaska seemed like a good bet. Big, empty, and cold enough to freeze out the past. Or so I hoped. Scrolling through obscure job boards in the dead of night, fueled by cheap whiskey and desperation, I stumbled upon it. An ad so blunt it felt like a derrick. Bartender wanted. Port Misery, Alaska. High pay. Accommodation provided. No experience necessary. Must be willing to follow specific house rules. Serious inquiries only. Port Misery. The name itself should have been a red flag the size of a barn door, painted blood red. But the high part screamed louder than my dwindling survival instinct. Accommodation provided meant I wouldn't freeze to death immediately. No experience necessary was a godsend, considering my only real qualification was being able pour a drink without spilling too much, while simultaneously trying to forget my own problems. The specific house rules bit, I brushed it off. Every place has its quirks, right? Probably meant stuff like don't overpour the regulars or mop the floor before closing. Standard stuff. How wrong I was. I sent off a quick email, expecting nothing. To my surprise, I got a reply within the hour. Terse, functional. Silas Kincaid. Owner, the Bitter Chill Tavern. Need someone reliable. When can you start? No interview, no background check, another red flag I cheerfully ignored. We exchanged a few more emails. He arranged the travel, a series of flights that felt like descending into progressively smaller, more isolated circles of hell. The final leg was on a bush plane, a rattling metal dragonfly that seemed held together by duct tape and sheer willpower. Below us stretched an endless, intimidating expanse of white and dark green. Snow-choked forests, frozen rivers carving gray scars across the land, mountains looming like jagged teeth on the horizon. There was nothing else. No roads, no towns, just wilderness that felt ancient and utterly indifferent to human existence. The pilot, a leathery man with eyes that seemed to have seen too much emptiness, didn't say much. When I asked about Port Misery, he just grunted. End of the line, son. Hope you know what you're getting into. We landed on a gravel strip scraped clean of snow, the landing gear groaning in protest. Stepping out of the plane was like stepping into a freezer. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, stinging my nostrils and lungs. A biting wind whipped snow devils across the runway. And there, huddled against the oppressive backdrop of the wilderness, was Port Misery. It wasn't a town so much as a collection of weathered buildings clinging stubbornly to a patch of semi-frozen ground near a dark, choppy inlet of water. Maybe 50 or 60 structures in total, mostly prefabricated boxes or log cabins, stained dark by time and weather. Snow piled high against their walls and drifting onto their roofs. Smoke curled from a few chimneys, thin gray tendrils against the heavy, overcast sky. There was a silence about the place that was profound, deeper than just the absence of traffic noise. It was the quiet of isolation, of being utterly cut off. Discovered why. The few people I could see moving between buildings were bundled up so heavily. They were just anonymous shapes against the snow. No one looked up as the plane landed. No one seemed to notice. A figure detached itself from the shadow of a low, long building near the airstrip and trudged towards me. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a thick parka, his face mostly hidden by a fur-lined hood and a thick, gray beard frosted with ice. When he got closer, I saw a face carved from granite, etched with lines that spoke of harsh winters and long nights. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were sharp and missed nothing. Jack Carter. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together. Yeah, you must be Silas. A. Kincaid. He didn't offer a hand, just gave a curt nod. Cabins this way. Taverns attached. He led me towards the largest building near the center of the cluster. The one I'd seen him emerge from. A simple wooden sign, bleached by the elements and barely legible, hung above the door. The Bitter Chill Tavern. The paint was peeling, the wood warped. It looked less like a welcoming establishment, and more like a place you'd hole up in during a siege. Silas pushed the heavy wooden door open, revealing a dim, low-ceilinged interior. It smelled of stale beer, wood smoke, damp wool, and something else, something metallic, and faintly unpleasant, I couldn't quite place. A long wooden bar ran along wall, scarred and stained. A few mismatched tables and chairs were scattered across the worn plank floor. A large stone fireplace dominated the far wall, a low fire crackling within, casting flickering shadows. It was empty, save for us. Place ain't much, but it's warm, Silas said, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. Your room's upstairs. Basic, but it's yours. Rent comes out of your pay, like we agreed. He led me up a narrow, creaking staircase behind the bar to a small, sparsely furnished room. A narrow cot, a rickety wooden dresser, a single bare bowl hanging from the ceiling, and one small window, looking out over the bleak expanse of snow towards the dark forest edge. It was cold, the chill seeping through the thin walls. Settle in, Silas said, turning to leave. Then come back down. Need to go over the rules. There it was again. The rules. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach. Colder than the Alaskan air. I dropped my duffel bag on the cot, the springs groaning miserably. Looking out the window, the sheer, crushing isolation of the place hit me full force. The forest felt too close, the silence too deep. I was hundreds, maybe thousands of miles from anywhere resembling civilization. No easy way out. Shaking off the feeling, I headed back downstairs. Silas was waiting. Seated at one of the tables, a steaming mug in his hands. He gestured for me to sit opposite him. All right, Carter, he began, his pale eyes fixing on mine. Port Misery. It's different. Folks here keep to themselves. Things work a certain way. You want to earn your keep and stay out of trouble. You listen close and you do exactly as I say. No questions, no arguments. Understand? I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. Understood. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping lower. These aren't suggestions. They're not guidelines. They're rules. You break him, and I can't help you. Nobody can. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The fire crackled, the only sound besides his rough voice. Rule number 1, he said, holding up a thick finger. The bar closes at 11:57 a.m., not 1:58. Not 200. 1:57 sharp. Lights out, door locked. Bolts slid home. Doesn't matter who's here. Doesn't matter if they're begging for one more. At 157, everyone is out, and the door is locked. Got it. The specificity was jarring. Why got it 157? Rule number 2. He held up a second finger. After midnight. If you hear whistling outside, don't matter what tune. Could be something you know, something you like. You ignore it. Stay away from the windows. Don't open the door. Pretend you hear nothing. If it gets loud, stuff your ears. It ain't for you. His eyes flickered towards the windows, a shadow passing over his face. My skin prickled. Whistling. Just ignore it, he repeated firmly. Rule number 3. We get a particular regular. Comes in maybe once, twice a week. Tall fella. Always wears the same dark green parka, hood pulled way down, even inside. You won't see his face much. He never talks. He'll just stand at the bar and point. He'll point to the top shelf, the expensive Islay scotch. You pour him one shot. Exactly one. Neat. No ice. No water. Pause, leaning closer. He'll pay with a silver dollar. Old. One, worn smooth. Don't put it in the till. There's a separate clay jar under the counter. Back left. Put his coin in there. Don't make small talk. Don't stare at him. Don't look him directly in the eye if you can help it. Pour the drink. Take the coin. Put it in the jar. That's it. Minimal interaction. A specific customer, a specific drink, a specific payment method kept separate. This was getting weirder by the second. Oh, tall guy, parka, points, one shot, silver dollar in the clay jar. Good. Rule number 4. Silas pointed towards the back bar where an assortment of bottles stood gathering dust. Among them, hanging from a small hook, was a tarnished silver bell, the kind you might see on an old hotel counter. That bell. You don't touch it. Don't polish it. Don't let any customer ring it. No matter how drunk or curious they get. It stays put. If that bell rings on its own accord, you drop whatever you're doing, you lock that front door, and you come find me. Day or night, don't hesitate. Understand, my heart was starting to beat faster. It rings. By itself. Silas just stared at me. His expression grim. Just hope it doesn't. Rule number 5. The old cannery down by the inlet. The ruined one, falling apart. Stay away from it. Don't go poking around down there. Especially not when the fog rolls in off the water. Which it does. Thick as soup sometimes. Locals don't go near it. You shouldn't either. There's nothing there for you. Fog, ruins, a forbidden zone. Classic. Right. Stay away from the old cannery. Finally. Rule number 6. He seemed almost reluctant to say this one. Every Tuesday night. Just before you lock up after you've kicked everyone out. At 157. Pour a small glass of fresh milk. Leave it on the windowsill of the back porch. Just outside the kitchen door. Doesn't matter if it's freezing, doesn't matter if it snows. Just leave the glass of milk. Milk. I blinked. Of all the bizarre instructions, this seemed the most mundane, yet somehow the most unsettling. Why? Silas sighed, a long, weary sound. He ran a hand over his beard. Don't ask why, Carter. There's no good answers to why in Port Misery. There's just the way things are. The way they have to be done to keep things quiet. You follow these rules to the letter. You'll collect your pay, and maybe you'll be okay. You start thinking you know better, you get curious, you cut corners. He trailed off, shaking his head slowly. Just don't. He stood up, the chair scraping harshly on the floorboards. That's it. Your shift starts tomorrow evening, 6 p.m. till close. Familiarize yourself with the stock. Keep the place tidy. And remember the rules. He left me there at the table, the list swirling in my head. 1:57 a.m. curfew. Ignore the whistling. The silent man with the silver dollar. The untouched bell. The forbidden cannery. The glass of milk on Tuesday. It was insane. It had to be some elaborate hazing ritual for the new guy, right? Some local superstition blown out of proportion. But looking at Silas's dead serious face, remembering the utter desolation outside, the oppressive silence, the way the pilot looked at me, a deeper, colder fear began to take root. This didn't feel like a joke. It felt like a warning. I went back up to my cold, bleak room. The wind howled outside, rattling the single-pane window. The bare bulb cast stark shadows. I sat on the lumpy cot, the list of rules repeating in my mind like a disturbing mantra. I'd come here to escape my problems, looking for a paycheck and anonymity at the edge of the world, staring out at the darkening landscape, the endless snow, swallowing the last of the daylight. I had the sudden, chilling thought that maybe I hadn't escaped anything at all. Maybe I had just traded one cut of trouble for another, far stranger, and far more dangerous kind. The first night in Port Misery stretched before me, long and unnervingly quiet, filled only with the sound of the wind and the weight of those inexplicable rules. My shift hadn't even started yet, but I already had a terrible feeling about the bitter, chill tavern and the secrets hidden in this frozen, forgotten town. My first week at the Bitter Chill Tavern passed in a blur of biting cold, long hours, and gnawing unease. The work itself was simple enough, pouring drinks, wiping down the perpetually damp bar, listening more than talking. Port Misery didn't exactly have a thriving nightlife. Most evenings, only a handful of patrons would trickle in, seeking refuge from the relentless dark and cold. They were a quiet bunch, mostly fishermen, trappers, or folks working the small, nearby airstrip. Weathered faces, hard hands, eyes that held the same distant, watchful quality I'd seen in Silas. They weren't unfriendly, exactly, but reserved, wary. They'd nod when I served them, maybe offer a curt comment about the weather or the fishing. But mostly they kept to their own tables, nursing their beers or whiskeys in a companionable, if slightly tense silence. They all seemed acutely aware of the rules, especially the closing time. The first few nights as 1:57 a.m. approached, I felt a ridiculous surge of anxiety. Would anyone argue? Would I have to physically eject some drunkard into the freezing night? But it never came to that. Around 1:50 a.m., a subtle shift would occur. Conversations would die down. Patrons would start draining their glasses, pulling on heavy parkas and gloves. By 1:55 a.m., the place would be empty, save for me and the lingering smell of stale boughs and wood smoke. Promptly at 1:57 a.m., I'd switch off the main lights, leaving only a single dim bulb burning over the bar, plunge the heavy bolt across the inside of the front door, and listen to the click echo in the sudden, profound silence. Locking that door felt less like closing up shop and more like sealing a tomb. Standing there alone in the dimly lit tavern, the wind howling outside like a hungry wolf, the isolation felt absolute. Sometimes, I imagined I'd hear faint, scratching sounds from the other side of the door moments after I'd locked it. But I told myself it was just the wind, just ice settling, just my frayed nerves playing tricks. Following rule number 1 was easy enough, logistically, but the feeling it left behind, that sense of shutting something out just in time, was deeply unsettling. The first Tuesday arrived, gray and colder than usual. As the last patron shuffled out into the darkness, I found myself standing in the small, cluttered kitchen behind the bar, holding a carton of milk. Rule number 6. It felt absurd. Pouring a small glass of perfectly good milk, carrying it to the rickety back porch door, and setting it on the icy window sill, like a prank I was playing on myself. The wind immediately whipped at the glass, threatening to knock it over. I wedged it slightly behind a loose piece of window trim and quickly retreated inside, locking the back door as well. What was the point? What nocturnal creature in this frozen hellscape drank milk left on a windowsill? I half expected to find it frozen, solid or buried in snowdrift the next morning. When I checked before opening the bar the following evening, the glass was still there, but it was empty. Bone dry. Not tipped over, not shattered, just empty. There were no obvious tracks in the snow around the port, which had seen a fresh dusting overnight. Just an empty glass sitting innocently on the sill. I told myself an Arctic fox or some other scavenger must have somehow gotten to it, despite the height of the sill. But the explanation felt thin, unsatisfying. I washed the glass and put away, the image of it sitting there, inexplicably empty, adding another layer to my growing unease. It was later that week that I encountered rule number 3. It was a particularly bleak Thursday night. Snow was falling heavily, muffling the already pervasive silence. Only 2 old fishermen were hunched over their beers at a corner table. The front door creaked open, letting in a blast of frigid air and a flurry of snowflakes. He fit Silas's description perfectly. Tall, broad, enveloped in a heavy, dark green parka that looked stiff with frost. The fur-lined hood was pulled so far forward that his face was almost completely obscured in shadow, just a hint of a strong jawline visible. He moved with a strange, deliberate slowness, shedding snow onto the floorboards as he approached the bar. He didn't make a sound. The 2 fishermen pointedly looked down into their drinks, avoiding eye contact. He stopped in front of me. I could feel a palpable cold radiating from him, colder even than the air he'd brought in with him. He didn't speak. He simply raised a gloved hand and pointed. A single, unwavering finger aimed at the top. Shelf Islay Scotch, the expensive Lafroig. My heart hammered against my ribs. My hands felt clumsy as I reached for the bottle and a clean shot glass. One shot. Exactly one. Neat. Silas's words echoed in my head. I poured carefully, the peaty aroma of the scotch filling the air. My hand trembled slightly as I placed the shot glass on the bar in front of him. Don't make small talk. Don't stare. Don't look him directly in the eye. I focused on wiping down a patch of the bar that was already clean, keeping my gaze averted. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw his gloved hand reach for the glass. He downed the shot in one smooth, silent motion. Then, he placed something on the bar. A silver dollar. Old, heavy, worn almost smooth, the details barely visible in the dim light. It gleamed dully against the dark wood. I remembered Silas's instruction. Separate clay jar under the counter, back left. Not the main till. Trying to appear casual, I picked up the coin. It was shockingly cold to the touch. Colder than metal had any right to be, even in this climate. It felt heavy, not just in weight, but with a sense of age, of history. I fumbled, slightly opening the cash register as a decoy, then reached under the counter, my fingers finding the rough texture of the earthenware jar Silas had pointed out earlier. I dropped the coin inside. It landed with a strangely muted clink, unlike regular currency hitting ceramic. When I looked up, he was already turning, moving silently back towards the door. He opened it, stepped out into the swirling snow, and vanished as abruptly as he had appeared. The door clicked shut. Why? Leaving behind only a dusting of melted snow on the floor and a lingering sense of profound wrongness. The two fishermen didn't look up until a full minute after he'd gone. One of them finally cleared his throat. Best not to think too much on him, son, he muttered, his voice raspy. He's just part of the scenery, like the cold. Later that night, after locking up at precisely 1:57 a.m., curiosity got at me. I retrieved the clay jar from under the counter. It felt heavier than it should. Inside, nestled amongst a surprising number of identical silver dollars, was the one the stranger had given me. They all felt the same, unnaturally cold, heavy, strangely smooth. How many times had he come here? How long had this ritual been going on? Whose faces had been worn away from these coins? I put the jar back, a shiver tracing its way down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Then came the whistling. Rule number 2, ignore it. Stay away from the windows. The first time I heard it, maybe a week and a half into my tenure, it was faint, almost lost in the omnipresent moan of the wind. I was in my small room of the bar long after locking up. It was a simple, meandering tune, unfamiliar. I remembered Silas's warning and forced myself to turn away from the window, picking up a tattered paperback I'd found. But my focus was shot. Every gust of wind sounded like the start of that tune. A few nights later, it happened again. This time it was closer, clearer. Still faint, but definitely whistling. A different tune this time, something that felt vaguely familiar, like a half-remembered nursery rhyme, but twisted somehow. Melancholic and off-key. It seemed to come from the direction of the dark woods bordering the town. I pulled the thin blanket tighter around me, my eyes fixed on the door. I felt an irrational certainty that whatever was whistling was aware of me, knew I was listening. It became a semi-regular occurrence, always after midnight, usually when the wind died down slightly. Sometimes it was distant, other times it felt like it was just outside the tavern walls. The tunes varied, but they always had that same unsettling quality, slightly off, slightly familiar, deeply unnerving. The worst part was the temptation. Why? An almost magnetic pull to go to the window, to peek through the curtains, to see what manner of thing could be out there, in the frozen darkness, whistling such lonely, eerie melodies. More than once, I found myself halfway across my small room, hand outstretched towards the window, before rule number 2 slammed back into my consciousness like a physical blow. I'd recoil, heart pounding, cursing my own morbid curiosity. Silas's warning, "It ain't for you," played over and over in my mind. My attempts to rationalize the rules were crumbling. This wasn't hazing. This wasn't local superstition run amok. The cold silver dollar, the empty milk glass, the persistent, predatory whistling, something was deeply wrong with Port Misery. I tried searching online again during the rare moments the satellite internet connection flickered to life, looking for history, folklore, anything about the town or its peculiar customs. Nothing. It was like the place barely existed beyond its name on a map. Any search strings involving Port Misery and strange occurrences, or local legends, returned dead ends or generic Alaskan tourist information. One afternoon, gathering the courage fueled by delight, I casually asked one of the quieter regulars, an old-timer named Elias, who mostly carved small wooden figures at his table, about the old cannery. Silas mentioned I should stay clear of the ruins down by the inlet. I said, trying to sound nonchalant. Elias didn't look up from his carving. His knife paused for just a second. "Silas is a wise man," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "Some places, they hold echoes. Best let 'em lie, especially when the fog comes." He resumed his carving, signaling the end of the conversation. His simple words, delivered with such quiet finality, were more chilling than a shouted warning. My unease solidified into a constant, low-grade dread. I felt perpetually watched, jumpy at every creak of the old building, every howl of the wind. Sleep offered little respite, often filled with fragmented dreams of whistling shadows and cold silver coins. One night, the whistling was worse than ever. It wasn't faint or distant. It was right outside my window. The tune was clear now, horribly, achingly familiar, a lullaby my mother used to sing. But it was warped, dragged out, notes bending sorely like a recording played at the wrong speed. It scraped against my nerves, simultaneously nostalgic and terrifying. It felt personal, targeted. I sat frozen on my cot, hands clamped over my ears, but the sound seemed to seep directly into my skull. The urge to look, to see who or what was producing that horrible, intimate sound, was almost overwhelming. Tears of fear and frustration pricked my eyes. "Ignore it. Don't look." I squeezed my eyes shut, repeating Silas's rule like a prayer, until, after what felt like an eternity, the awful, corrupted lullaby finally faded, leaving only the sound of the wind and my own ragged breathing in the oppressive silence of the Alaskan night. I knew then, with chilling certainty, that following the rules wasn't just about keeping my job. It was about survival. The Alaskan winter deepened its grip, locking Port Misery in a seemingly endless cycle of crushing darkness and biting cold. Days were short, dim affairs where the sun was a pale rumor low on the horizon. Nights stretched into near infinity. Time in the tavern warped and blurred, marked only by the slow drip of the tap, the crackle of the fire, the wary faces of the regulars, and the oppressive weight of the rules. My initial unease had metastasized into a constant, thrumming anxiety. Sleep was thin and riddled with nightmares, whistling lullabies turning into shrieks. Bottomless clay jars swallowing silver coins, fog coiling like grasping fingers. I was functioning, yes. Pouring drinks, making change. Locking up at precisely 1:57 a.m. I left the milk out every Tuesday, finding the glass inexplicably empty each Wednesday morning. I studiously ignored the whistling that sometimes clanged at my window pane, though it now occasionally seemed to whisper my name, the old name. The one I'd run from, making the hairs on my neck stand on end. But beneath the surface of routine, I felt myself fraying. The isolation wasn't just physical anymore. It was sinking into my bones, into my mind. The visits from the silent man in the green parka became slightly more frequent, maybe every 4 or 5 days now. Each encounter left me feeling colder, more drained. I stuck to the scripting, pour the single shot of Islay Scotch, accept the unnaturally cold silver dollar, place it in the clay jar hidden beneath the counter, avoid eye contact. But my morbid curiosity sometimes got the better of me. Once, as I took the coin, my fingers brushed against his glove. The cold wasn't just temperature. It felt like an absence of heat, profound and draining. Another time, I risked a slightly longer glance towards his hooded face as he turned to leave. In the deep shadow beneath the hood, I thought I saw not eyes, but something that glittered faintly, like chips of obsidian or frozen starlight. And the silence around him wasn't just quiet. It was a heavy, pressing void, absorbing the ambient sounds of the tavern. When he left, it was like the air rushed back in to fill a vacuum. The coin jar under the counter felt heavier each time, a growing hoard of cold, dead silver. The whistling, too, grew bolder. One night, it wasn't just my mother's lullaby. It was her voice, or a cruel, perfect imitation of it, humming the tune right outside my door, followed by a soft, questioning Jack. "Are you in there, honey?" My blood ran cold. I clapped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, chanting Silas's rule like a protective ward. It knew me. It knew how to tempt me. The urge to rip open the door, to confront the mocking imitation, was almost unbearable. It took every ounce of willpower to stay frozen on my cot until the voice finally, eventually, faded back into the moan of the wind. Rule number 5, concerning the old cannery, had been easy enough to follow. The ruins sat at the edge of town, skeletal fingers of rotting wood and rusted metal clawing at the sky near the dark, ice-choked inlet. Even in daylight, the place radiated neglect and a vague sense of menace. Locals visibly skirted around it, their paths tracing wide arcs to avoid getting too close. But one afternoon, the fog rolled in. It came suddenly, silently, off the water, a thick, gray-white miasma that swallowed the town whole in minutes. Visibility dropped to near zero. I'd stepped out the back door to take a bag of trash to the bins, located a short distance behind the tavern, closer to the inlet side. The fog disoriented me instantly. I took a few steps, turned, and suddenly couldn't see the tavern anymore. Panic flared. Everything looked the same, swirling gray nothingness. The air was damp, unnaturally still, and smelled faintly of salt and something else, something like decay, metallic and unpleasant. I took a few hesitant steps in what I thought was the right direction, but the ground felt uneven, littered with debris I didn't recognize. Then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound cutting through the fog. Clank. Scrape. Scrape. Like metal dragging on rock, coming from somewhere ahead of me in the gray soup. And beneath it, a low, wet, guttural sound, almost like breathing, but ragged and thick. My heart leaped into my throat. Why? I realized with a jolt of terror that I must have wandered towards the inlet, towards the forbidden ruins of the cannery. The sound seemed to be coming directly from that area. Rule number 5 screamed in my head, stay away. Especially not during a fog. I could feel an intense pressure, a sense of being watched by something unseen within the swirling vapor. The clanking and scraping continued, closer now. I spun around, desperate, trying to get my bearings. Was that a faint flicker of light back the way I came? Praying it was the tavern, I stumbled blindly towards it, slipping on icy patches, my breath catching in my throat. The horrid scraping sound seemed to follow me for a few steps, before being swallowed by the fog and the frantic pounding in my ears. I practically fell through the tavern's back door, slamming it shut and leaning against it, gasping for air, my body trembling. The warmth and familiar smells of the bar felt like sanctuary. Silas was behind the counter, polishing glasses. He looked up, his expression unreadable. But his eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than usual. Bit thick out there, was all he said, his voice calm. But I had the distinct feeling he knew exactly where I'd almost blundered. The near miss left me shaken for days. The memory of that clanking, scraping sound, and the feeling of unseen eyes in the fog, haunted my waking thoughts. The final layer of my carefully constructed denial was stripped away by rule number 4. The silver bell. It hung on its hook on the back bar, tarnished and unassuming. I'd obeyed Silas implicitly, never touching it, pointedly ignoring it, instructing the rare curious patron to leave it alone. Yet, I sometimes felt my eyes drawn to it. In the deep quiet of the late nights, after locking the door at 1:57 a.m., I occasionally fancied I saw the dust motes dancing in the dim light, move strangely around it, as if disturbed by a faint vibration. I told myself it was my imagination, amplified by fear and isolation. Then, one frigid evening, it happened. The tavern was moderately busy. A half-dozen patrons nursing drinks, the fire crackling, the wind howling a gale outside. I was rinsing glasses at the sink behind the bar, my back to the room. Suddenly, cutting through the low murmur of conversation and the storm's roar, came a single, clear, resonant sound. Ting, it wasn't loud, but it sliced through the air like a shard of ice. Every head in the tavern snapped up. Conversation ceased instantly. The fire seemed to crackle lower. The wind outside momentarily hushed. A suffocating silence descended, thick with unspoken dread. My blood turned to ice water. The silver bell, it hadn't just vibrated. It had rung. On its own. I spun around. The bell hung perfectly still on its hook, gleaming faintly in the dim light. But there was no mistaking the sound. Every patron was frozen, their faces pale, eyes wide with a shared, primal fear I now recognized mirrored my own. They weren't looking at the bell, they were looking at me. Waiting. Rule number 4, if that bell rings on its own accord, you drop whatever you're doing. You lock that front door and you come find me. Day or night. Don't hesitate. My hands were shaking violently as I fumbled for the keys. All right, folks. I managed. My voice sounding strangled and thin. Closing time. Now. There were no arguments, no protests. They practically scrambled for their coats. Their movements jerky with urgency. Fear radiated off them in palpable waves. Within 30 seconds, the tavern was empty. I slammed the heavy bolt across the front door. My heart hammering against my ribs so hard it hurt. The silence that followed was terrifying. Charged with an unseen, imminent threat. Find Silas. Immediately. He lived in a small cabin attached to the back of the tavern, accessible through the kitchen. I burst through the kitchen door, nearly colliding with him, as he emerged from his quarters. Already pulling on his heavy parka. His face grim. Eyes narrowed. He didn't need me to say anything. He'd heard it too. How long ago? He demanded, his voice tight. Just now, I stammered. Maybe a minute. I locked the door. He nodded curtly, grabbing a heavy, old-fashioned storm lantern from a hook and a long, heavy looking firearm, some kind of shotgun or rifle, from a rack by his door. The sight of the weapon sent a fresh wave of terror through me. Stay here, he commanded, his voice low but absolute. Keep the doors locked. Don't open them for anything. Don't look outside. Don't make a sound. Understand? I nodded mutely, unable to speak. He checked the load in the firearm, his movements economical and practiced. Then, without another word, he unbolted the back door and stepped out into the howling storm and the oppressive darkness. The lantern casting a weak, flickering pool of light around him before the swirling snow and the night swallowed him whole. Huh? The door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the silent, cold kitchen. The echo of that single, terrifying chime still ringing in my ears. The rules weren't just quirks or superstitions anymore. They were defenses, and one of them had just been breached. I was locked inside the bitter chill tavern, waiting in the dark, wondering what horrors Silas had gone out to face, and praying he would come back. The silence in the kitchen, after Silas stepped out into the storm, was the lewdest thing I'd ever heard. It pressed in on me, thick and suffocating, broken only by the frantic thumping of my own heart and the distant, muted howl of the wind. Every creak of the old building sounded like footsteps. Every gust rattling the window panes sounded like claws scraping against the glass. I stood frozen, back pressed against the sturdy kitchen door, straining my ears for any sound from outside: gunfire, shouting, screaming, anything. There was nothing but the wind and the terrifying, pregnant silence. Rule number 4's implication hung heavy in the air. The bell ringing meant something was wrong. Something had gotten through, or was trying to. Silas had gone out to meet it. What was it? The whistler. The entity hinted at by the empty milk glass. Something drawn to the cold silver of the silent man's payments. Or something else entirely. Drawn from the shadowed ruins of the cannery or the deep, dark woods. My imagination conjured horrific shapes, moving in the swirling snow. Drawn by the bell's chime like moths to a deadly flame, minutes stretched into an eternity. I couldn't bear the kitchen's claustrophobic silence any longer. Tiptoeing, I moved into the main tavern area, extinguishing the single dim bulb over the bar, plunging the room into near total darkness, relieved only by the dying, flickering embers in the stone fireplace. I huddled near the hearth, peering uselessly out the front windows, which were thick with frost and snowdrifts anyway. Don't look outside, Silas had commanded. But the not knowing was almost worse. Was he okay? Was it still out there? Was it trying to get in? Once, I thought I heard a heavy thump against the front door, muffled by the storm, but it wasn't repeated. Was it just snow sliding off the roof? Or something testing the lock? It felt like hours had passed, though the old clock on the wall suggested it was barely 30 minutes. When I finally heard the back door rattle, I froze, every muscle tensed. A key scraped in the lock, the bolt slid back, and the door opened. Silas stumbled in, bringing a blast of frigid air and fine snow with him. He looked ravaged. His parka was torn at the shoulder, dark stains blossoming on the fabric. Stains I prayed were just melted snow and grime, but somehow knew weren't. His face was deathly pale, beneath the frost clinging to his beard, etched with new lines of exhaustion and pain. He leaned heavily against the doorframe, his breathing harsh and ragged. The heavy firearm was still clutched in his hand, its barrel strangely free of snow, almost as if it radiated a faint heat. He didn't say where he'd been or what he'd faced. He just looked at me, his pale eyes seeming older, wearier, colder than ever. "It's dealt with," he rasped, his voice strained. "For now." He pushed the door shut and bolted it again, his movements stiff. Rule held. "You did good. Locking up fast." He offered no other explanation. He didn't need to. The look on his face, the tremor in his hands, as he leaned the firearm against the wall. The dark stains on his coat, they spoke volumes. Whatever threat the bell had signaled was real, dangerous and costly to repel. Seeing him like that, seeing the raw fear and exhaustion beneath his gruff exterior, was the breaking point for me. The high pay, the accommodation, the desperate need to hide from my past, none of it mattered anymore. This wasn't a job. It was a prison sentence in a town haunted by things that made grown men arm themselves and step out into lethal storms. The rules weren't just bizarre. They were a fragile dam holding back unimaginable horrors. And tonight, that dam had cracked. I couldn't spend another night listening to the whistling, dreading the silent man's arrival, jumping at shadows, wondering if the bell would ring again. I had to get out. The decision, once made, settled in my gut with cold resolve. Escape wouldn't be easy. Port Misery wasn't connected by road. The only way out was the way I came in, the bush plane. But it didn't run on a regular schedule, often grounded for days or weeks by the weather. And Silas had arranged my arrival. He likely controlled departures too, over the next couple of days, while nursing Silas through what he gruffly dismissed as a fall on the ice. Though the torn parka and his pained movements told a different story. I subtly probed. I mentioned missing civilization, needing supplies the town didn't offer. Silas just grunted noncommittally, his eyes sharp, watchful. He knew what I was thinking. I needed leverage. I needed payment for the flight. My wages, automatically deposited, wouldn't be enough for a last-minute, unscheduled charter, assuming the pilot would even agree. Then I remembered the clay jar. The silent man's payment. Rule number 3 demanded I keep it separate. But it didn't say why, or what it was for. It felt wrong, dangerous even, but desperation claws away at principles. Late one night, when Silas was asleep, breathing heavily in his room, I crept behind the bar. My hands shook as I lifted the heavy clay jar. It felt colder than ever. Tipping it out onto a bar towel. The silver dollars spilled out with that same muted, dead clink. There must have been 50 or 60 of them, worn smooth, depicting faces and symbols I couldn't recognize, radiating that unnatural chill. Taking a deep breath, I scooped up a handful, maybe 20 coins, stuffing them deep into my pocket. They felt like ice against my leg. I put the rest back, hoping Silas wouldn't notice the difference immediately. Using the tavern's temperamental satellite phone, when Silas was out checking traps, I managed to reach the pilot who'd flown me in. His voice was wary when I explained I needed a flight out, urgently. "Bad weather comin'," he said, "and Silas usually arranges. What's an emergency?" I lied, my voice tight. "Family. And I can pay, handsomely." In silver, there was a pause. Then, grudgingly, "If there's a window tomorrow morning, just after dawn, I might be able to make it. Maybe. Weather holds, fuel holds. Be at the strip, cash up front. Or silver, if that's what you got. Don't be late." "I won't wait." The line went dead. The next hours were agonizing. I packed my meager belongings into my duffel bag, the cold silver coins heavy in my pocket. Every creak of the floorboards, every howl of the wind, sounded like discovery. I barely slept, waiting for the first hint of gray light that passed for dawn. Before the town stirred, I slipped out the back door of the tavern, my bag clutched tight. The air was knife-sharp cold, the sky a bruised purple overhead. Stars still glittered like chips of ice. The town was silent, huddled shapes under a blanket of fresh snow. I moved as quickly and quietly, as I could towards the airstrip at the edge of town, my boots crunching loudly in the stillness. Fear was a physical presence beside me. Fear of Sila's finding me gone. Fear of the whistling starting up. However, fear of seeing the tall man in the green parka emerge from the shadows. Fear of the fog rolling in suddenly, trapping me near the skeletal ruins of the cannery. As I passed the path leading towards the inlet, I risked a glance. The cannery stood stark against the pre-dawn sky, windows like empty eye sockets. Was that a flicker of movement near the crumbling walls, or just a trick of the light? I didn't wait to find out, hurrying my steps, my breath pluming white in the frigid air. The airstrip was deserted, a flat expanse of windswept snow and gravel. I scanned the sky anxiously. Was the pilot coming? Or had I doomed myself for nothing? Then, a faint drone reached my ears, growing steadily louder. A single light appeared in the eastern sky. The bush plane. Relief washed over me, so potent it almost buckled my knees. The plane touched down, skiss grating on the gravel strip beneath the snow. The pilot, the same leathery man from before, cut the engine quickly and peered out at me, his expression impatient. Got the payment. I hurried forward, pulling the handful of cold silver dollars from my pocket. My fingers were numb, fumbling with the coins. As I held them out, the pilot's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. He took them without touching my skin, his movements quick, almost snatching them away. Get in, he barked, avoiding my gaze now. Quickly. I threw my bag into the small cargo space and scrambled into the passenger seat. The door slammed shut, sealing out the profound silence of Port Misery. As the engine sputtered back to life, and we began to taxi down the runway, I looked back at the huddle of dark buildings. Standing near the bitter, chill tavern, partially obscured by the swirling snow kicked up by the propeller, was a figure, tall, broad-shouldered. Silas. He wasn't moving, wasn't waving, wasn't shouting, just standing there, watching me leave. In the dim light, I couldn't tell if his expression was angry, resigned, or something else entirely. But the sight sent a final chill down my spine. As the plane lifted off, banking over the dark inlet, I saw Port Misery laid out below, a tiny, isolated cluster of lights and structures against an overwhelming wilderness. The cannery ruins looked like broken teeth grinning up at me. The dark forest pressed close on all sides. It looked impossibly small, fragile, and utterly trapped. I flew away from Port Misery, back towards a word I barely remembered. I never went back to my old life, my old name. I kept moving. But Alaska at Port Misery, it never really left me. The high pay sits untouched in an account I rarely access. The real price of that job wasn't measured in dollars, or even in the cold silver coins I used to buy my freedom. Coins I sometimes imagine I can still feel. Cold and heavy, in a pocket that's long been empty. The price was the fear that lingers, the gnawing paranoia that creeps in during the dead of night. Sometimes, when the wind blows a certain way, I still think I hear faint whistling. Sometimes in a crowd, I see a tall figure in a dark coat, and my heart seizes. Until I see their face, I avoid desolate places, thick fog, and the dead silence of the early morning hours. I escaped Port Misery. I survived. But some part of me is still there, locked in that cold room above the bar, listening to the wind, waiting for the bell to ring. Forever bound by rules I never understood, guarding against a darkness I can never truly forget. And I'm left wondering, were the rules meant to keep the horrors out? Or were they meant to keep the bartender in?